Crash on the unknown world. Captain Kel Winters jolted awake, his head throbbing from the impact. Disoriented, he blinked to clear his vision, the cockpit's dim emergency lights illuminating broken wires and shattered screens. His ship, the starbound Voyager, lay in ruins around him, a twisted mass of metal and circuitry, half buried in the strange earth of an unknown planet. Smoke filled the air, stinging his eyes and making it hard to breathe. Kel's fingers fumbled with the safety harness, finally unbuckling himself. He fell forward, catching his balance before he stumbled out of his seat. Every bone in his body ached, but survival instincts kicked in. He had to assess the damage. He moved to the rear of the ship, grimacing as he saw the extent of destruction. Bulkheads bent inward, wires hanging like vines, and most systems offline. The hull was breached in multiple places, but miraculously, the cargo hold remained intact. He breathed a sigh of relief as he opened the cargo hatch, checking his supplies. His emergency pack was still there, along with his blaster, a few ration packs, and a small medical kit. It was hardly enough to keep him alive for long, but it was a start. As he reached for his equipment, a strange, humid breeze swept through the cracked hull. He grabbed his bag and headed toward the exit, his heart pounding as he faced the unknown. The hatch opened with a hiss, and Kel was hit by a wave of heat and the smell of wet earth. He squinted as he stepped out, his boots sinking into the soft, mossy ground. Massive trees towered around him, their branches intertwined into a dense canopy that filtered the sunlight into a dim, greenish glow. Unfamiliar creatures chittered in the distance, and vibrant plants with thick, waxy leaves surrounded him on all sides. This was no ordinary planet. The landscape felt alive, almost sentient. "What have I gotten myself into?" Kel muttered, scanning the area. His ship's navigation system was destroyed, and without it, he had no way of knowing his location or contacting help. The realization settled heavily on him. He was alone, stranded on a world that might as well have been on the other side of the galaxy. He checked his supplies, 3 days' worth of water, a small amount of food, and basic survival gear. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. His immediate priorities were clear: find a water source, set up a shelter, and try to establish some kind of signal. As he took stock of his surroundings, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The forest was eerily quiet, the only sounds the occasional distant rustle or call of alien wildlife. With his blaster at the ready, Kel ventured cautiously into the jungle. Every step sank into the thick undergrowth, and the air was thick with moisture, making it hard to breathe. He could feel his muscles tensing with every sound, his senses heightened. His years in the Galactic Fleet had taught him to trust his instincts, and they were screaming at him to be on guard. Hours passed as he pushed through the dense vegetation, his shirt soaked with sweat. The jungle was an alien labyrinth, with unfamiliar plants and creatures that seemed to eye him curiously from the shadows. He stumbled upon a stream of crystal-clear water, relief flooding him as he filled his canteen. He took a moment to drink, savoring the coolness that spread through his body. As the sun began to set, Kel found a small clearing near the water's edge and decided it would be a safe spot to set up camp for the night. Using materials from his emergency pack, he rigged a makeshift shelter from branches and leaves. He built a small fire, more for comfort than warmth, and sat down to take stock of his situation. The quiet of the jungle was unsettling, a silence that felt unnatural. He couldn't shake the sensation of being observed, as though the forest itself were aware of him. He scanned the surrounding trees, but saw nothing, just shadows shifting in the dim light. The fire cast flickering patterns on the nearby foliage, and Kel's thoughts drifted back to his crew, wondering if they'd managed to escape the ship before it crashed. As he stared into the flames, a faint rustling broke the silence, and Kel's hand instinctively went to his blaster. His pulse quickened as the rustling grew louder, coming from the shadows just beyond the light of his campfire. Kel's eyes narrowed, his grip on the blaster tightening. Out of the darkness stepped a figure, a slender, graceful form with skin that glowed faintly in the firelight. She looked almost human, but her eyes were larger, her pupils reflecting the light like those of a nocturnal predator. She wore garments woven from leaves and vines, blending seamlessly with her surroundings. Her gaze met his, a mix of caution and curiosity in her expression. Cale lowered his blaster slightly, his voice calm but firm. "Who are you?" The woman tilted her head, studying him. After a moment, she spoke, her voice soft and musical, though her words were unfamiliar. Cale recognized her tone. It was the universal language of curiosity, the attempt to communicate across a vast divide. She took a cautious step forward, her eyes never leaving his. "I don't understand," he said slowly, keeping his voice gentle. He gestured to himself. "Cale." Then he pointed to her, eyebrows raised in a questioning look. She seemed to understand, nodding slowly. She placed a hand on her chest. "Seraphine," she said, her voice like a whisper in the wind. Cale repeated her name, feeling its foreign cadence roll off his tongue. "Seraphine." A faint smile played on her lips, but she remained guarded, watching him with a mixture of interest and suspicion. Cale lowered his blaster, deciding to take a risk. He took out his canteen and offered it to her. "Water," he said, hoping she'd understand. Seraphine hesitated, then reached out with delicate fingers, taking the canteen. She sniffed it cautiously before taking a small sip, her expression softening slightly as she handed it back. They sat in silence, each studying the other, two beings from different worlds trying to bridge an impossible gap. Finally, Seraphine spoke again, her words still unintelligible, but there was a pleading tone in her voice. She gestured toward the jungle, her eyes filled with urgency. Cale watched her, trying to decipher her meaning. She seemed desperate, her body tense, as though she were fleeing from something. He pointed to himself, then to the jungle, trying to convey his willingness to follow her. A flicker of relief crossed her face, and she nodded, gesturing for him to come with her. Cale extinguished the fire, packed his supplies, and stood ready to follow. He knew it was a gamble. He had no idea where she was leading him, or if he could trust her. But his instincts told him that this was a chance worth taking. As they moved through the dense jungle, Seraphine glanced back at him occasionally, her expression softening as she saw his steady pace. Cale felt a strange sense of connection, an unspoken bond that transcended words. She led him through the underbrush, her movements graceful and practiced, guiding him over roots and around dense patches of foliage. They reached a grove of towering trees, their trunks thick and covered in glowing blue moss. Seraphine stopped, raising a hand to silence him. She pointed to a cluster of large stones arranged in a circle, their surfaces etched with symbols that glowed faintly in the darkness. Cale watched as she knelt beside the stones, her hands tracing the symbols with reverence. She looked back at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear, as though she were asking him to share in something sacred. Cale knelt beside her, studying the symbols. He didn't understand their meaning, but he felt the weight of them, a sense of ancient power and purpose that hung in the air. He placed a hand on one of the stones, meeting her gaze with a silent vow of trust. As the moonlight filtered through the trees, illuminating their faces, Cale knew that his journey had only just begun. Into the heart of mystery, Cale followed Seraphine through the tangled jungle, her silent guidance leading them deeper into a part of the forest untouched by light. Here, the foliage was so thick it formed a natural roof, blocking the sky. The air grew cooler, and a faint blue glow radiated from strange, bioluminescent plants sprouting from the trees and ground. He moved carefully, watching her footsteps and trying to match her movements. Every time he stepped on a twig or shifted a leaf, she glanced back, her expression one of cautious tolerance, though her eyes sparkled with intrigue. The jungle around them was alive with unfamiliar sounds, soft chirps, distant roars, and the faint rustle of unseen creatures. Cale's hand hovered near his blaster, but he knew better than to draw it unnecessarily. Seraphine moved with a steady, deliberate grace, guiding him through the dense underbrush until they reached a clearing where massive stone pillars rose from the earth, covered in vines and moss. The stones looked ancient, covered in intricate carvings similar to the ones they had seen earlier, symbols that pulsed faintly in the darkness. Seraphine gestured for him to stop as they reached the edge of the clearing. She pointed to the pillars, then placed a hand on her lips, a universal gesture for silence. Cale nodded, squinting through the dim light. His eyes adjusted, and he began to make out movement around the pillars. Figures were standing there, cloaked in shadow, their forms barely visible in the faint light. Seraphine's gaze held a mixture of reverence and anxiety, as if she were torn between loyalty and fear. One of the figures turned, and Cale's breath caught. This was no ordinary alien. The being was tall, its skin an iridescent shade of blue that shimmered with each movement. Its eyes glowed faintly, and a cloak of dark, fibrous material hung from its shoulders, blending with the shadows. It moved with the calm dignity of someone who belonged there, as if guarding the stones was a sacred duty. Seraphine whispered something in her native language, her voice barely audible. Cal didn't understand the words, but he sensed their meaning. These beings were the keepers of this place, protectors of whatever power lay hidden within the stones. He felt Seraphine's hand on his arm, urging him to follow as she led him around the edge of the clearing, staying hidden in the shadows. She moved with incredible stealth, and he did his best to mimic her, although his clumsy attempts occasionally earned him a look of exasperation. As they circled the clearing, they reached an area where the forest opened up, revealing a path that sloped downward. Seraphine led him to the entrance of a tunnel, its entrance half hidden by vines and underbrush. She pushed them aside, gesturing for him to follow her inside. Cale hesitated, glancing back at the clearing. He felt an instinctual pull to stay in the open, to avoid enclosed spaces on an unknown planet. But Seraphine's urgency was clear. She motioned to the entrance, then at the sky, where faint beams of light began to filter through the trees. The sun would soon rise, and Cale understood that the cover of darkness was essential to avoid detection. He took a deep breath, steeling himself as he ducked into the tunnel. The air inside was cool and damp, with the faint scent of moss and stone. Seraphine moved quickly, her footsteps echoing softly in the narrow passage. The walls were lined with more of the glowing symbols, illuminating their way with a soft, ethereal light. As they descended, the silence grew more profound. The only sounds were their breathing and the soft shuffle of their feet against the stone floor. Cale glanced at Seraphine, wondering where she was leading him, but her expression was unreadable, her focus entirely on the path ahead. The tunnel opened into a vast chamber, its ceiling high and domed, with strange markings carved into the stone above. In the center of the room was a pedestal, and atop it sat a large crystal, its surface glowing with a brilliant blue light. Cale felt an inexplicable pull toward it, as if the crystal held some kind of magnetic energy. He took a step forward, but Seraphine held out her hand, stopping him. She motioned for him to wait, then approached the pedestal alone. She placed her hands on the crystal, closing her eyes as she muttered a series of soft, rhythmic chants. The symbols on the walls began to glow brighter, and a low hum filled the room, resonating in Cale's chest. He watched in awe as the crystal's light pulsed, matching the rhythm of Seraphine's voice. She seemed to be drawing energy from it, her figure bathed in a soft, blue aura. When she opened her eyes, they were filled with a fierce determination. She turned to him, her expression one of urgency, and spoke in her language, her voice laced with intensity. Although he couldn't understand her words, her meaning was clear. The crystal was a source of power, a relic of great importance to her people, and she needed his help to protect it. Cale nodded, his mind racing with questions. He wanted to ask her what the crystal was, why it was so important, and who the beings at the stones were. But before he could speak, a loud, metallic clang echoed through the tunnel. Seraphine's eyes widened in alarm, and she grabbed his arm, pulling him toward a small alcove hidden in the shadows. They pressed themselves against the wall, listening as heavy footsteps approached. Kel's pulse quickened, and he tightened his grip on his blaster, ready to defend himself if necessary. The footsteps grew louder, and he saw a shadowy figure emerge at the entrance to the chamber. It was one of the blue-skinned guardians from the clearing, its cloak billowing as it stepped into the light. It moved with a graceful, predatory elegance, its eyes scanning the room. Kel held his breath, hoping they wouldn't be discovered. Seraphine placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch grounding him, calming his nerves. She pointed to the far side of the chamber, where a narrow passageway led deeper into the mountain. Kel understood. They needed to escape before the Guardian noticed them. They moved silently, slipping through the shadows as they made their way to the passage. But just as they reached it, the Guardian's gaze snapped in their direction. It let out a low, guttural growl, its eyes narrowing as it drew a sleek, silver weapon from its cloak. Kel's instincts kicked in, and he raised his blaster, firing a warning shot that echoed through the chamber. The Guardian dodged with inhuman speed, its movements fluid and calculated. It lunged toward them, weapon raised, and Kel barely had time to react, stepping back as he fired again. The blast missed, and the Guardian closed the distance in a heartbeat, its weapon slashing through the air. Kel stumbled, barely managing to dodge as he fell to the ground. Seraphine stepped forward, chanting in a voice that filled the chamber with a strange resonance. The symbols on the walls flared, and the Guardian hesitated, its eyes widening in surprise. Taking advantage of the distraction, Kel aimed carefully, firing a direct shot that struck the Guardian in the shoulder. It let out a hiss of pain, staggering back as its weapon clattered to the ground. Seraphine pulled Kel to his feet, and they ran toward the passageway, their footsteps echoing in the narrow corridor. They emerged into another tunnel, this one sloping upward, leading them back toward the surface. Kel's heart pounded as they climbed, the air growing warmer with each step. They burst out into the jungle, the sunlight blinding after the dim light of the tunnels. Seraphine grabbed his arm, pulling him into the shadows of the trees. They crouched in silence, catching their breath as they listened for any signs of pursuit. After a few tense moments, they heard the distant sounds of footsteps fading into the jungle. The Guardian had lost their trail, at least for now. Kel turned to Seraphine, his breath heavy. What was that thing? Why was it guarding the crystal? Seraphine's gaze was solemn as she met his eyes. She placed a hand on his chest, then pointed to the jungle, her expression filled with a silent plea. Kel understood. The crystal was a treasure of immense importance, and there were forces on this planet that would stop at nothing to control it. He nodded, a fierce determination settling over him. Together, they would protect the crystal, no matter what dangers lay ahead. The ancient bond. The sun filtered through the dense jungle canopy as Kel and Seraphine pressed onward, moving quickly to distance themselves from the tunnel entrance. Every so often, Kel glanced back, his mind still reeling from the encounter with the Guardian in the underground chamber. The creature's haunting, intelligent gaze and its relentless defense of the crystal lingered in his thoughts. It was as if the Guardian itself had been bound to protect the artifact, an unbreakable duty etched into its very existence. Seraphine led him deeper into the jungle, weaving a path between towering trees and thick clusters of alien plants that seemed to watch their every move. Despite the oppressive heat and the persistent hum of strange creatures lurking in the shadows, she moved with a grace that betrayed her familiarity with this land. Kel struggled to keep up, though he forced himself to ignore the discomfort and stay focused. His instincts told him that she was leading him somewhere important, and he trusted her guidance, even if he still knew little about her or this mysterious world. As they traveled, the terrain began to change, the ground sloping upward as the jungle gave way to rocky foothills. Seraphine finally stopped at the edge of a cliff, the ground dropping away to reveal a breathtaking view of a lush valley below. In the distance, a massive stone structure stood half-buried in vines and moss, its ancient architecture partially concealed by the thick vegetation. Kel took in the sight, feeling a strange sense of awe. The structure was unlike anything he had ever seen, Massive, monolithic stones arranged in spiraling patterns that seemed to pulse faintly with the same blue energy as the crystal. Seraphine pointed to it, her eyes filled with a mixture of reverence and urgency. She muttered something in her language, her voice soft but intense, as if trying to convey the weight of what lay ahead. They descended carefully, picking their way down the rocky path toward the structure. As they drew closer, Kel began to notice carvings etched into the stone, symbols that seemed to mirror the ones in the underground chamber. He could feel the energy emanating from the place, a low hum that resonated in his chest, matching the faint pulse he had sensed from the crystal. This was no ordinary ruin. It was a sacred site, filled with a power that was both ancient and alive. When they finally reached the base of the structure, Seraphine gestured for him to stop. She closed her eyes, placing her hands on one of the stones, and began chanting softly. Her words, though unintelligible, seemed to weave a spell around them, wrapping the air in a heavy silence that even the jungle creatures respected. The stone beneath her hands began to glow, the carvings lighting up one by one as if in response to her voice. As Kel watched, a hidden entrance appeared at the base of the structure, a narrow doorway that had been concealed by an illusion of vines and moss. Seraphine beckoned for him to follow, her gaze filled with a quiet determination. Together, they stepped inside, the shadows swallowing them as they ventured into the unknown. The passageway was dimly lit by the same glowing symbols, casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls. Kel's footsteps echoed softly, each step seeming to disturb the silence that hung thick in the air. He could sense that this was a place of significance, a site where the mysteries of Seraphine's people were preserved and protected. They reached a large chamber, its walls adorned with intricate murals depicting scenes of battle, ceremony, and worship. Kel's eyes roamed over the images, piecing together fragments of a story told through symbols and shapes. He could see figures resembling Seraphine and her people, locked in battle against monstrous creatures and otherworldly beings. In the center of the mural was a familiar shape, the crystal, radiating light and energy as if it held the power of an entire star. Seraphine approached the mural, her fingers tracing the lines of the crystal. She turned to Kale, her eyes sullen, and began to speak in broken but understandable English. "This, our history," she said, her voice soft and reverent. "The crystal, our world's heart, protector of balance." Kale nodded, listening intently as she struggled to find the right words. "The crystal is the source of life here." She nodded, her expression filled with a sadness that seemed to reach into the depths of her soul. "Once we lived in peace, but others came. They sought power." She gestured to the monstrous figures in the mural, her face tightening with a mixture of anger and sorrow. "They took, destroyed, many lost." Kale understood. The crystal was not just a source of power, it was a lifeline, a relic of great importance that sustained this world. And those who had come before, invaders, conquerors, had tried to claim it for themselves, leaving a path of destruction in their wake. "Is that why the Guardian attacked us?" he asked, his voice quiet. "To protect the crystal from anyone who might take it." Seraphine nodded, her gaze distant. "Guardian, bound to crystal, protects until end." Kale felt a pang of sympathy for the creature. It was not acting out of malice, but out of duty, a loyalty ingrained so deeply that it was willing to lay down its life to keep the crystal safe. He wondered if, in some strange way, the Guardian was as much a prisoner of its role as Seraphine was of her heritage. As they stood in silence, Seraphine reached out and took his hand, leading him deeper into the chamber. They passed through another doorway, emerging into a smaller room where a pedestal stood at its center, bathed in a soft blue light. On the pedestal lay an amulet, its surface engraved with the same symbols as the crystal and the walls around them. Seraphine lifted the amulet carefully, holding it out to Kale. "This for you," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Guardian sees you, as ally. The crystal chose you." Kale's brow furrowed, unsure of her meaning. "What do you mean? I don't understand." She placed the amulet around his neck, her fingers lingering on the cool metal. The crystal connects us all. It knows who seeks to protect. It felt your spirit. He looked down at the amulet, feeling its weight against his chest. It was as if the crystal itself had given him a part of its energy, binding him to its purpose. He didn't fully understand the implications, but he knew this was a responsibility he could not take lightly. As they left the room, the ground trembled, and a low rumble filled the air. Seraphine's eyes widened in alarm, and she grabbed his arm, pulling him back toward the entrance. They ran through the narrow passage, their footsteps pounding against the stone as the rumbling grew louder, echoing through the chamber. When they emerged into the jungle, Kel looked back just in time to see the entrance collapse, the stones crumbling into a pile of rubble. The path they had taken was now buried, sealing away the secrets of the structure. Seraphine's face was pale, her eyes reflecting a mix of sorrow and determination. Kel placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We'll protect it. Together." She nodded, her expression softening as she met his gaze. They shared a moment of quiet understanding, a bond forged through shared purpose and a commitment to something greater than themselves. As they moved away from the collapsed entrance, a sudden movement in the trees caught Kel's attention. He raised his blaster, his senses on high alert as he scanned the jungle. From the shadows emerged a group of figures, their cloaks blending seamlessly with the foliage. They moved with the same fluid grace as the Guardian, their eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. One of the figures stepped forward, lowering his hood to reveal a face marked with intricate tattoos, symbols similar to those on the walls of the chamber. His gaze was piercing, and he held up a hand in a gesture of peace. "We come in peace," he said, his voice calm but firm. "We are the keepers, protectors of the crystal. We have watched over it for centuries, bound by the same duty as the Guardian you encountered." Kel lowered his blaster, exchanging a glance with Seraphine. The keeper's words echoed her own, and he felt a sense of relief that they were not alone in their mission. The keeper nodded, acknowledging Kel's silent understanding. "You carry the amulet," he said, his gaze falling to the symbol hanging around Kel's neck. "The crystal has chosen you as its guardian. You are bound to it now, as we are." Kel felt the weight of the amulet against his chest, a constant reminder of the responsibility he had accepted. He met the keeper's gaze, a silent vow passing between them. "We will protect it," he said, his voice steady. "Together." The keeper inclined his head, a faint smile on his lips. "Then we stand with you. For as long as the crystal endures, we are bound to its purpose, and so are you." As the sun set over the jungle, casting a warm glow over the ancient stones and the gathered figures, Kel knew that his journey was far from over. But he also knew that he was not alone, and that he would fight alongside Seraphine and the keepers to protect the crystal and the balance it maintained. The amulet pulsed faintly against his chest, a steady heartbeat that connected him to the ancient power of the crystal and the generations of guardians who had come before him. Together, they would face whatever challenges lay ahead, bound by duty, honor, and an unbreakable bond that transcended time and space. Shadows of the past. The sun had dipped low, casting long shadows across the jungle as Kel, Seraphine, and the keepers made their way through the dense undergrowth. The air was thick with the scent of earth and the low hum of distant creatures awakening with the onset of twilight. Kel felt the weight of the amulet against his chest, its cool metal pressing into his skin, a constant reminder of the duty he had accepted. The keepers moved with a quiet, almost ethereal grace, their footsteps barely disturbing the fallen leaves, while Seraphine stayed close to Kel, her eyes scanning the surroundings with a watchfulness he'd come to recognize as second nature to her. The keeper who had first spoken, a tall figure named Rael, walked slightly ahead, leading the group toward a location he referred to only as the sanctuary. Kel had tried to ask him more about it, but Rael had merely given a solemn nod, as if the place itself would answer all questions in time. As they moved deeper into the forest, Kel noticed the jungle itself seemed to change, as though they were entering a different world. The trees grew taller, their trunks covered in intricate markings similar to those on the crystal and the amulet. Soft, bioluminescent plants illuminated the path ahead, casting a blue glow that felt both calming and ominous. The silence weighed on him, and Kel couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He glanced at Seraphine, who seemed equally tense, her eyes darting to every flicker of movement in the shadows. Finally, he couldn't hold back his curiosity any longer. "Rael," he called quietly, "where exactly are you leading us? What is this sanctuary?" Rael slowed his pace, turning to face Kale, his expression calm but his eyes serious. "The sanctuary is an ancient place, a remnant of the time before the Great Rift. It is a place of memory, where the spirits of our ancestors still reside. There, you will see what the crystal truly is." Kale frowned, his curiosity deepening. The Great Rift. Rael's gaze grew distant, his voice a low murmur. "Long ago, our world was united, its people living in harmony with the crystal's power. But when outsiders came, drawn by tales of the crystal's energy, everything changed. They sought to control it, to harness its power for their own purposes. Their greed caused a rift, a tearing of both land and spirit that has never fully healed." Seraphine spoke up, her voice a soft whisper. "The crystal's energy is life itself, a gift from our ancestors. It was never meant to be wielded as a weapon, but they twisted it, tried to bend it to their will. Many perished, and our people were left scattered, divided." Rael nodded. "The sanctuary holds the memories of those who once protected the crystal, the original keepers. In their wisdom, they bound the crystal's power with ancient rites, creating guardians to protect it. We honor their sacrifice, and now so must you." As they continued through the forest, Cal's mind raced, processing everything Rael had told him. He had known the crystal was significant, a relic of power, but he hadn't understood the true weight of it. This was a legacy, one marred by conflict, sacrifice, and a deep-rooted sense of duty. After what felt like hours, they reached the edge of a clearing. In the center stood a towering stone structure, circular in shape, with smooth, polished walls that seemed to glow from within. Unlike the ruins he had seen earlier, this place was intact, preserved against time's decay. The air around it felt charged, vibrating with a quiet energy that made Kel's skin tingle. Rael gestured for them to enter. "The sanctuary awaits. Step with reverence, for here, the past lies." Kel nodded, his chest tight with a mixture of awe and trepidation. As they stepped inside, the temperature dropped, a coolness that sank deep into his bones. The interior of the sanctuary was vast, its walls adorned with murals depicting the ancient battles Seraphine and Rael had spoken of, scenes of warriors standing against dark, towering figures and fierce beasts that seemed born of nightmares. At the center of the room was a raised platform, and upon it lay a shimmering pool, its surface reflecting the swirling colors of the murals above. Rael stepped forward, raising his arms in a silent invocation. The room fell silent, and Kale felt a pressure building in his chest, as though the air itself had thickened, becoming dense with unseen energy. Rael gestured to the pool, his voice barely a whisper. "This is a hot water, a reflection of the crystal's spirit. Look into it, Kale. Only then will you understand." Hesitant but compelled, Kale approached the pool. He peered into its depths, the surface shimmering like liquid glass, its colors shifting and merging in an endless dance. As he stared, the colors began to form shapes, images that flickered and blurred before resolving into a scene that seemed to pull him in. He was no longer standing in the sanctuary, but in the midst of a vast battlefield. Around him, warriors clashed, their weapons glinting in the strange, pale light of a distant sun. The air was thick with the sounds of battle, shouts, the clash of metal, the roar of strange beasts. He could see both Seraphine's people, their skin glowing faintly, and the monstrous invaders, towering figures cloaked in shadow with eyes that burned like embers. Amid the chaos, a figure stood at the heart of the battlefield, holding the crystal aloft. The figure was ancient, their features obscured, but Kale could sense their strength, their resolve. The crystal blazed with a fierce light, pushing back the darkness, holding the invaders at bay. But Kale could feel the strain, the weight of power that even the crystal bearer struggled to control. And then a voice echoed in his mind, a voice that seemed to come from the crystal itself, filled with a sorrowful wisdom. We are bound to protect, but we are also bound to sacrifice. Only through unity, through harmony with the life around us, can we endure. The scene shifted, and Kale saw the figure collapse, the crystal slipping from their grasp as the battle raged on. The invaders seized the crystal, wielding it like a weapon, its light twisting and darkening under their control. The land itself seemed to cry out in pain as the power within the crystal was turned against it, tearing the very fabric of reality. The images faded, and Kale found himself once more in the sanctuary, his heart pounding. He took a shaky breath, struggling to process what he had just seen. The crystal was not simply a relic of power, it was a living force, a part of the very essence of this world. It had been wielded as a weapon once, but the consequences had been devastating. He understood now why the keepers protected it so fiercely, why they were willing to lay down their lives to prevent it from falling into the wrong hands. Rael stepped forward, his expression grave. "Do you see now, Kale? The crystal's power is both a gift and a burden. Those who wield it must do so with wisdom and respect, or risk unleashing unimaginable destruction." Kale nodded slowly, the weight of Rael's words settling heavily on him. "I understand. This is a responsibility greater than I ever imagined." Seraphine took his hand, her eyes filled with a quiet determination. "You are not alone in this, Kale. We stand with you, as our ancestors stood with each other. Together, we protect, and together, we endure." The other keepers gathered around them, each one placing a hand on the pool, their faces solemn. They began to chant in their native language, their voices rising and blending in a harmonious melody that filled the sanctuary, resonating with the energy of the hot water. Kale felt the amulet around his neck grow warm, pulsing in time with the chant, as if responding to the collective will of those around him. In that moment, Kale felt a profound sense of unity, a connection not only with the keepers and Seraphine, but with the very essence of the world around him. He could feel the jungle, the trees, the creatures hidden in the shadows, all bound together by the same energy, the same life force that flowed from the crystal. The chanting faded, and Rael looked at him, his gaze steady. "The crystal has chosen you, Kale, but it is not a power to be wielded lightly. There will be those who come, drawn by its energy, blinded by their own desires. You must be vigilant, for you carry not just the crystal's power but its legacy. You are now its guardian." Kale nodded, feeling a new resolve settle over him. He understood the gravity of his role, the responsibility he had accepted, but he also knew he was not alone, that he had allies who shared his purpose, who would stand beside him no matter the cost. As they left the sanctuary, the jungle seemed to embrace them, the shadows shifting as if watching over them. Kale felt the amulet's warmth against his chest, a steady reminder of the journey that lay ahead. Whatever challenges they would face, whatever darkness would come, he knew they would face it together. And in that moment, beneath the ancient trees and the watchful eyes of the keepers, Kale vowed to protect the crystal, to honor the legacy of those who had come before, and to ensure that its power would never again be used to bring harm. For he was now the crystal's guardian, bound to its fate as surely as it was bound to his. The gathering storm. The days that followed were a blur of preparation and planning as Kale, Seraphine, and the keepers worked together to fortify the jungle paths leading to the crystal's hidden sanctuary. They knew that the peace they had now was only temporary. The crystal's presence on this world was too powerful, too unique, to remain unnoticed forever. And Kale felt a growing certainty that others, outsiders, perhaps those who had torn this world apart once before, would come looking for it again. Rael had assigned teams of keepers to various watchpoints around the sanctuary. Some hid in the treetops, others blended with the shadows of ancient stones, their movements so silent that Kale often had to remind himself they were even there. Seraphine, too, was constantly on alert, moving through the jungle with a quiet determination that both impressed and reassured him. It was as if she had become a part of the forest itself, her presence a comforting shadow at his side. One evening, as Cal sat by a small campfire near their makeshift base, Seraphine joined him, her face illuminated by the flickering light. She handed him a bowl of a stew she had prepared using local roots and herbs. The food was earthy and slightly bitter, but it filled his stomach with a comforting warmth. "They will come soon," Seraphine said quietly, breaking the silence. Kale looked up, meeting her gaze. "You think so?" She nodded, her expression grim. The crystal's energy, it calls to them. Even now, it pulses, reaching across the stars. There are those who would feel it, who would follow its call. They won't rest until they find it. Kale stared into the flames, his mind swirling with thoughts. "Then we need to be ready. But there's only so much we can do. I don't want to put your people at risk." Seraphine placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "The Keepers have protected the crystal for generations. It is our duty, our purpose. We are prepared to make sacrifices if it means keeping the crystal safe." Her words resonated deeply with him, a reminder of the weight he now carried. He wasn't just a stranger stranded on an alien world. He was now a part of their legacy, a guardian bound by ancient duty. The amulet around his neck pulsed faintly, as if echoing his thoughts, its warmth a steady reassurance. Before he could respond, a sharp cry echoed through the jungle, shattering the silence. Kale leaped to his feet, his blaster at the ready, as shadows flickered in the trees. Rael emerged from the darkness, his expression tense. "They're here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Outsiders, armed. They've landed near the edge of the valley." Kale's heart raced. He had hoped for more time, but it seemed fate had other plans. He glanced at Seraphine, whose face was a mask of calm determination. She nodded, understanding his silent question. "Lead the way," Kale said, his voice firm. "Let's meet them before they get too close." The group moved quickly through the jungle, slipping between trees and undergrowth with practiced silence. Kale's senses were heightened, every sound amplified, every shadow a potential threat. They reached a ridge overlooking the valley, and Rael gestured for them to crouch low. From their vantage point, they could see a sleek, metallic ship settled in a clearing below, its surface gleaming under the moonlight. Figures moved around it, dressed in armored suits with visors that glowed faintly, casting eerie blue shadows on the ground. Kale counted at least a dozen, each armed with heavy blasters and scanning devices. They were organized, moving with the precision of soldiers, their weapons at the ready. This was no random expedition. They were here with a purpose, and Kale could guess what it was. One of the figures, taller than the others and carrying a device that pulsed with a blue light, raised a hand, signaling for silence. They spoke in low tones, their words muffled, but Kale could hear enough to confirm his suspicions. "The signal is strongest in this direction," the leader said, pointing toward the heart of the jungle. "The crystal is close. We move in teams, no one strays. And remember, no unnecessary casualties. We're here to retrieve the asset and get out." Kale clenched his fists, his mind racing. These were mercenaries, likely hired by someone who knew of the crystal's power and intended to harness it for their own purposes. He felt a surge of anger, a fierce determination to protect the crystal and this world from those who would exploit it. Rael placed a hand on his shoulder, his expression grave. "We must act carefully. They are well-equipped, and a direct confrontation could cost us dearly." Kale nodded, formulating a plan in his mind. "Then we don't give them a direct fight. We use the jungle, the shadows, keep them off balance, confuse them." Seraphine's eyes sparkled with a fierce intensity. "The jungle is our ally. We know its paths, its secrets. They are intruders here. They won't last long if we deny them their technology." Together, they devised a strategy. The keepers would divide into small teams, each tasked with leading the mercenaries on a chase through the jungle. They would use traps, misdirection, and the natural terrain to isolate and disorient the intruders, keeping them from reaching the sanctuary. Kale and Seraphine would focus on the leader, the one carrying the scanning device, to ensure they couldn't trace a signal back to the crystal. As the mercenaries began their advance into the jungle, the keepers sprang into action. Kale watched as Rael led his team to intercept one of the mercenary squads, guiding them toward a dense thicket where the foliage was thick enough to obscure vision. The mercenaries moved cautiously, their movements deliberate as they scanned the surroundings, unaware of the silent figures slipping through the shadows around them. A faint rustle in the underbrush was all it took to set off their alarm. One of the mercenaries fired into the shadows, the bright flash of the blaster momentarily illuminating the trees. But the keepers were gone, melting into the darkness as quickly as they had appeared. Meanwhile, Kel and Seraphine closed in on the leader, who was still advancing through the jungle, his scanning device held high as it emitted a low hum. Kel could hear the mercenaries' frustrated voices through their comms, their confusion growing as they realized they were being led in circles. "Team Alpha, report," the leader barked, his voice tense. "Where are you?" Only static greeted him, and Kale saw the leader's shoulders tense with frustration. Taking advantage of the moment, Kale fired a warning shot that struck a tree just beside the leader. The mercenary spun around, his blaster raised, scanning the darkness. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice edged with fear. Kale stepped into view, his blaster trained on the leader. "Turn back," he said coldly. "This jungle doesn't welcome outsiders." The leader narrowed his eyes, his visor glowing as he assessed Kale. "You're the one causing this trouble. We're here for the asset. We don't have to make this messy." Kale smirked, unfazed. "The crystal doesn't belong to you. It's protected by those who understand its power. Leave now, and maybe you'll live to see another day." The leader laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. "You really think you can stop us? We've dealt with worse than you." Before Kale could respond, Seraphine appeared behind the leader, silent as a shadow, her eyes fixed on him with a fierce intensity. She held a spear made from sharpened wood, the point aimed at the leader's back. "This is your last warning," she said, her voice steady. "Leave or face the jungle's wrath." The leader hesitated, sensing the resolve in her voice, the unwavering determination in her gaze. But pride and greed overpowered caution, and he raised his blaster, aiming it at Kel. In an instant, Kel fired, his shot aimed precisely at the scanning device. The blast shattered it, sending sparks flying as the device fell from the leader's hand. "You fool," the leader snarled, backing away as he realized the extent of his loss. Without the device, they had no way of tracking the crystal's signal. His squad was scattered, his equipment disabled, and he was stranded in an unforgiving jungle with no guidance. Kale stepped closer, his voice low and menacing. "This is your last chance. Leave, and take your team with you. If you stay, you'll be lost in this jungle forever." The leader's face twisted in anger, but he knew he was beaten. With a reluctant nod, he turned, signaling to his remaining mercenaries to regroup. Kale and Seraphine watched as they retreated, disappearing into the trees, their footsteps hurried and chaotic. When the last of them had vanished, Kale let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He glanced at Seraphine, who gave him a small, approving nod. "You did well," she said softly. "The crystal is safe, for now." Kale nodded, though a lingering unease gnawed at him. He knew this wouldn't be the last time outsiders came seeking the crystal's power. The amulet around his neck pulsed faintly, as if reminding him of the responsibility he now carried. "We'll keep it safe," he said firmly, more to himself than to anyone else. "Whatever it takes, we'll protect it." Seraphine smiled, a look of quiet pride in her eyes. Together, they returned to the sanctuary, the jungle closing around them like a protective shroud. But Kale knew that the path ahead would only grow more treacherous. The storm was coming, and he would need every ounce of strength, courage, and unity to face it.